So this is a talk about early Japanese computing. And in a nutshell, most people that have heard about Japanese computers have heard about them from one of these three sources, either Nintendo or Sega consoles, MSX, which is pretty popular outside of Japan, in Europe, or in Brazil, or alternatively the X68000. Actually, there's examples of all these on display outside. But there's a lot of interesting Japanese history that's not actually captured at all by Western audiences popularly. Most people are familiar with the Western Trinity of the Tandy TRS-80 Model 1, the PET 2001, and also the Apple II. All these came out in 1977. Today's talk is really going to be talking about the Japanese version of the Trinity. So before I get into that, there's always these debates when we bring people like this together in terms of who was first and so on. So you can see a few examples of different computers that have had claims to they were the first of. But I'm going to go to Wikipedia's definition here in regards to what a personal computer is. Multi-purpose computer whose size, capabilities, and very importantly price makes it feasible for individual use, and also that it's intended to be operated directly by an end user as opposed to a computer expert. It's important to understand that definition because what you'll see in history is that someone might mark it as a PC, but it actually ends up being a business computer or something in that respect. So we'll just jump straight into it. So this topic is the forgotten 1977 microcomputer and also the original Japanese Trinity. So very quickly we'll set the scene, and I'm only going to spend a couple of slides doing this, talking about the scene in Japan leading into the microcomputer boom, and then talk about those different computers. Also, just a caveat to start, this says, Watashi wa Nihongo ga wakarimasen, which means I don't understand Japanese. And the challenge is that a lot of the source material for this is in Japanese, and so it makes it very challenging to... So sometimes you see inaccuracies, and there's, particularly with the topic I'm going to talk about today, there's tons of inaccuracies out there. So this is September 1945, and back at the USS Missouri, the Japanese Army Chief of Staff and the Foreign Minister basically surrendering to the US at the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, Japan was devastated in many different ways. Obviously, they'd had 2 atomic bombs dropped, but they'd lost 2 million people in terms of the actual war. And culturally, they were devastated. They obviously had a feudal society leading into World War II that was very military-wise, very aggressive. And also economically, they were devastated. And going into this phase post-war, you can see that Japan had been slowly building. So what you have on this graph is you have the US and the British in terms of their economies. And what you see is going into the war, Japan actually was growing as they expanded into Asia. And then during the war, just got smashed. And then at the end of the war were really bad. But then they have this phase where they basically grow to a ridiculous extent where they actually overtake the British economy. And so there's 2 phases to this. First off, when they were being occupied, and this was really MacArthur having an oversight of Japan while they were rebuilding. This was until about 1956 roughly. And in this phase, like the Americans wanted to do 2 things. One is they wanted to make sure that when there was a vacuum that they didn't want the Soviets to come and jump in. But the second thing is leading into the war, the powers behind the scene were the really strong Japanese samurai families, let's say. So this is called Zaibatsu. And what they wanted to make sure is that Zaibatsu didn't step into the vacuum as Japan was rebuilding. So they were trying to break that down. Then there's the next phase, which is this phase where they have hypergrowth, directed by the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And we'll talk about that just briefly now. So basically, this is a central organisation that was a central architect for the Japanese economy. And they would have these different structures within the economy called kairetsu. And so how it worked is the Japanese government would basically say, hey, we want Honda, we want you to only build motorbikes. and they would sit there and actually direct what each of these different entities were doing. And so how it would work is then MITI would be working with the central bank. The central bank would give a loan to a local bank, and then the local bank would basically give loans or essentially free money to these organisations, no interest, and all in exchange that they were delivering on Japanese policy. And all of these entities around the keiretsu would take shares in each other, they would trade with each other. And so they weren't just a giant corporation, they were a combination of giant corporations. And so you look at the major early Japanese computer makers, Hitachi, NEC, Fujitsu, Sharp, not as much. They were less known for computers in this point. All of them were members of keiretsu. So one of the things to note about early Japanese computing is it's not like what we have in the West where we got Jobs and Wozniak working together, or two guys in the HP garage, doing their innovation and then building up. It's like these mega corporations that built these computers. Also, just quickly, and this is kind of my last real history slide, Japan pretty much had heavy involvement with the production of semiconductors from the point where Bell started to license out production of transistors at the end of the 50s. So they went from having R&D of like 2% of the economy, of their spend, up to about 26% getting towards the end of the 70s. And so MITI formed this organisation called LSI Research. And the idea behind LSI Research, it was a project that went for about 4 years, ending in 1980. And the idea was that even though they had access to manufacturing semiconductors and compute, the problem is that they were way, like at least 2 generations behind the Americans, so they were always playing catch up. And so with LSI Research, they were all working out, okay, how do we manufacture to either catch up to the Americans or even get ahead of the Americans? And to kind of fast forward, by the end of the 80s, because of advances they made in electron beam lithography and things like this, they did 51% of the world's semiconductors, and they probably had 70% of the world's DRAM market. So now we get into the computery bits. So this is one of my computing heroes, a guy called Takayoshi Shina. And Takayoshi Shina started off selling DEC mini computers in the 60s. And really he was quite successful because what he would do is he would sit down and translate English content into something that can be consumed by Japanese speakers. And his observation was that all these people that were selling computers in the Japanese market were too focused on the hardware and not actually using the computers. So he had a vision, and so he eventually left Rikkei to start up his own company. So his vision in 1970 was, I want to create a $3 billion company. I want to make it sure that it's multinational, not just focused on the Japanese market. And I want to build a computer for 500,000 yen or less. Now, to give you an idea, and we're talking mini computers here, a mini computer back in this time would have cost 10 million yen. So his idea was to severely disrupt the industry. And he wanted it in such a way where it was well integrated for a native Japanese person to walk up and start using the computer. And his big challenges were, how do I get the startup capital? And also, how do I get talent to do this? And there's 2 major challenges there. So he started up a company called Sword, and he got investment from his mother and uncle, who both took executive positions in Sword. And they rebranded to Sword Computer Systems basically because there was confusion with an existing company with a similar sounding name in Japanese. But why Sword is a really interesting company to me is that it was one of those, starting off in the garage type innovator Western style companies that was trying to fight against some pretty major powers. So Shina ended up recruiting a guy called Nobushiro Sato from Burroughs. Now, if Shina is, let's say, Jobs, then this guy is his Wozniak. So this guy, they actually went to university together, and it took some convincing for him to get Sato to leave Burroughs, because how it works in Japan is normally when you start a job, let's say at NEC, you have a career for life. So your career is all mapped out for you. You've got a job for life. It's complete job security. So any time you go, hey, I'm going to go leave and go work somewhere else, you actually disturb that. And definitely doing this was incredibly risky. So what these guys ended up doing is they started selling logic testers, panel meters, these sorts of things. It wasn't even covering costs, but it was just trying to get some yen through the door while they were researching their ideas of how could we build a 500,000 yen or less computer. And so when they were looking at the technology that was available at the time, some major things got in the way of that. One is to buy 4K of memory, back in those days, that was 300,000 yen. Now, this is the start of the 70s. Back in those days as well, I/O is all being done by big reel-to-reel tape, and this is literally millions of yen. So you've got some really difficult inhibitors there. The idea, so what they started to see was with the progress that LSI was making, that the cost performance curve was going up exponentially, going down exponentially, and one of the things, and this is actually, I started talking to Kerry about this. He asked me some questions around disk drives. That Sato and Sheena were frequently going to the US to get ideas and whatever else to basically build their own computers. And they ended up seeing disk drives on display. And so what this enabled for them was not just random access memory, but an I/O device that would be practical that would only be 200k yen, this sort of thing. So they're starting to go, okay, I'm almost there. So finally, and I'll just say, Sheena now starts to think not just about taking on mini computers, but actually starting to think about computers for an individual use. So Sword come out with their first design in '72, and it was called the SMP 8008, and it was based on the Intel 8008. So first processor 4004, and then the next version of that is the 8008 coming out in '72. And so they start to design and spend money on building a computer, and with 1K in memory, but what they find is once they actually finish the design and start manufacturing it, it's faster to do calculations by hand. And so it's a nice idea, but it's just not practical. And so they had a massive psychological blow. They're going, are we in the right game? Should we completely change what we're doing? And so they reviewed their designs and they went, nah, it's just a problem of CPUs not being fast enough at this point. So in '74, Intel comes out with their next processor, which is the 8080. And this could address 64 times more memory, but more importantly, is about 5 times faster. And so demand was extremely high just inside the US to get access to 8080. Intel could not meet the demand for this. And so because Sheena and Sato have been going to the US for years, they actually managed to get hold of 5 chips. And they actually built their own computer. And what they did is they really took the design of the SMP 80 and adapted it for the 8080. So literally, Intel announces the 8080. 2 months later, they've got a computer that they're displaying the 8080 in at a Tokyo show. Industry could not believe that they've produced a computer. And just to give some relative dates on this, they basically came out in May '74. The Altair 8800 came out in January '75, so early mover. And it was half the price of competing American designs, but you can still see that it's not quite meeting what Sheena wanted to get to with the 500,000 yen computer. So a 4K model, 800K, as you can see, going from there. So this took the industry by storm. They couldn't produce them fast enough, although one of the challenges was some of the buyers for the SMP 80 were actually like their competitors, basically wanted to pull the design apart and do their own. So at this point, Sheena starts to think about, okay, I wouldn't mind expanding into the US doing these sorts of things. Now, changing tack completely. Through 1975 to 1978, there was a massive explosion in interest of Japanese folks that were interested in computers, whether they could afford one or not. And so you can see a few of these single board designs. I don't know what those designs might remind anyone of. But they're a bit like the Kim 1. So if you think about what Kim 1 was, or Commodore Kim 1, or MOS Kim 1, what that was really a board to educate around what a computer could do with using, a MOS chip. And so basically there was probably about at least 12 players coming up with these single board designs, and they're all ranging from about 80 to 100,000 yen. But they also were very limited in what they could do. They really were training/educational, like, let's understand what a computer could possibly do, but a bit like what I was talking about with that early Sword computer, way too slow for any general purpose usage. And so the people that were interested in these things were really hobbyists. So really it was people that used computers at work or students. I'm going to skip through that. So then we get this micron phase and NEC specifically. So NEC were a leader in this space. And where it starts is they set up a space in Akihabara called the Bit In. So think of, like, I guess, don't groan at this, but like an Apple Genius bar. So people would basically come in and just basically play with computers in this space. And so NEC basically established a bit in Akiba in 76 and launched the TK80, which is that single board computer. And that was the most popular of those single board computers. And really they viewed it as a showroom for their products, but what ended up happening is it became a mecca for hobbyists. So NEC had expected at the high end that they would have maybe 200 units sold a month, and demand immediately was like 2,000 units a month. So it was way beyond what they were expecting. And without reading all that crap, the NEC, why NEC I think was successful from the 70s into the 80s and even into the 90s is actually because they had a really well built out distribution network. They actually had some cool technology, but I think that their reach was way better than any of their competitors. So they built more bit-ins around Japan, and then they also built satellites of other kind of like mini bit-ins that would display their technology. So we get to 1977 and the Trinity's coming out, and without going through that again, so another computer comes out, and this is the Sword M200. Now, Sword were marketing this as the Sword M200 smart home computer, and it came out in September 77, which, by the way, is a month before the PET was available. So the PET got announced in January 77, but you couldn't buy one till October 77. So this thing comes out, and what Sheena has in mind is something that's an all-in-one device. So you can kind of see integrated keyboard, integrated screen, integrated disk drive, and he really was thinking primarily about taking on the American market. And so you look at the capabilities here, and it's got a Z80 CPU, it's got 64K in memory, it's got a Japanese enhanced keyboard, I won't talk about that now, and you can see all those characteristics. It also weighs 30 kilos. My question to you is, why did this fail? It cost 1.5 million yen. So compared to people playing around with $100,000 single board kind of computers, you now go to something that's 15 times the price. It was just infeasible for a home user to really buy this. So that was never going to be successful in that market. So getting into 1978, the M200 did have a little bit of success, but not in the home computer market. So it was marketed as a smart home computer. Really, the buyers were business. They ended up actually coming out then with an M100. So Kerry Richards popped in here before and said, hey, M100 was my first computer. So the M100 was actually their attempt at getting into the market. And this was marginally successful at that. The main thing I'll draw your attention to, it's got a little bit less RAM. Well, actually, full travel keyboard. Actually, that's a M100 Ace, so it's a little bit different. But you'll notice that the price is 199,000 yen. So double the price of one of those single board computers, but actually can do quite a lot. So now I would actually argue that this was the first Japanese home computer. But I would also say that if you look at Sword, their success was largely in business as opposed to the home computing space, but they definitely made an impact there. What we also see is now foreign interests in the market. So in April 78, Commodore and Apple both emerged, and Tandy also in August got into the Japanese market. At the end of 78, 90% of PC sales were those computers. So now I'm going to talk about the original Japanese Trinity. So the first one, the first release computer out of the Japanese Trinity was the Hitachi Basic Master. And what you'll notice in all the computers I'm about to talk about is I've written 6800 here, which is a Motorola 6800. But next to that, you've got HD 46800. And that's, so when Western companies would come into being able to sell into Japan, there was they had to sign an agreement to say, we will technology share. So basically you'll see that there's always Japanese versions of these processors. So Hitachi actually manufactured this Motorola 6800. And so you've got a 6800, 4K of RAM, level 1 basic, and basically a character to display, 32 by 24 and then 64 by 48. So it did have a limited amount of graphics capability, but very limited, and that was more to support katakana. I've written there Motorola CPU as its biggest strength and weakness. As anyone who's a home computer enthusiast might know, things like the MOS 6502 and the Z80 were way, like 1/6 to 1/10 of the price of trying to buy a Motorola chip. So having that Motorola chip definitely put them a little bit behind. There were a number of Japanese computers that followed on from the Basic Master, and one that I'll draw your attention to is the MB6890. I don't know if anyone might remember this, but in the early 80s, Hitachi sold in the Australian market this thing called Hitachi Peach, which is an MB6890. So that's 2 versions later than this. And that was a very capable, fully graphical kind of computer. It looks a lot like an Apple II. Then we have the next of the Trinity, which is the Sharp MZ80K. Now, this thing kind of almost looks a little bit pet-like, but not really. It's got the interesting keyboard. It actually came as a kit. Everything you had to assemble except that the monitor was built into the case, so everything else you had to assemble. And it was Z80 based. Now, interesting thing about pretty much any Sharp computer of this era, unlike most computers where you might turn it on, you'll get a basic in ROM. These things had a 4K ROM in them, and generally when you turned them on, you then get faced with a prompt of, would you like to load basic off tape, or would you like to do these other? So you get a prompt for, so they have a really minimal ROM, but it allowed you to, it's quite interesting because you could go and edit basic and then load it or do things like this. It's quite an interesting capability. Once again, very limited graphics. The price is about 198,000 yen. And as you can see, you've got all these devices that are hanging off it. You've got disk drives and graphics expansions. These computers were very, very expandable compared to, let's say, the Basic Master. Now, this is the horrible, horrible family tree of Sharp computers. And you can see it all starts with the MZ80K in the corner. And there's some inaccuracies in this family tree. I plucked it off the web somewhere. But what I would quickly say is what you have is you've got the MZ80K, and then it branches into a bunch of kind of like business computers for the MZ, and then some home computers for the MZ. Then you have the X1 series, if anyone's heard of those, and the X1s eventually kind of move into then later on the X68000. And then you have a completely separate set of business computers. A lot of confusion there, and I'll talk about why that is shortly. So, and then we have the NEC PC8001. Now, this came midway through 1979. However, it is, in my opinion, very clearly it is more powerful than those other 2 computers. It has, once again, NEC's version of a Z80 in there at 4 megahertz with 16K of RAM. Very strong graphical capability by comparison, and had colour pretty much off the bat, a bit like the Apple II. Even though you could basically configure it with all sorts of things, printers, disk drives, I/O expansions, memory expansions, etc. Generally, someone would buy one of these wedges, they might buy a screen, and they generally bought a tape, and that was it. And cassettes were very popular in this day and age, even though you see so many disk drives on these computers. It had a beautiful keyboard. Dave Merton's got one of these out on display, although it's not running anything at the moment. But if you pick it up, the thing was built like a tank. And you can see that actually how NEC priced this at the very start was 168,000 yen. So they aggressively started to go after their competitors. And just to show you the capabilities, just briefly, I know this is not doing much here, but if you look at these are some games on the MZ80K, and you can kind of see it's all kind of character-based, you know, kind of Petsky style graphics. Where if you look at then capabilities of, let's say, a PC8001, you know, pretty graphical, you know, particularly if you've got a colour display, pretty nice. So as things moved on, in 1979, so just 1 year later after 1978, half of the sales in Japan actually were Japanese computers. And over time that changed quite a bit. PC shops started to open up very rapidly right across, and I won't get into all that. And you know, when I was talking about the single board computers before, there was a shift from students and people that use computers at work to actually like Japanese salarymen, so just normal workers. And just because, you know, had keyboards, had screens, people could access them without flipping switches. And so what had been previously called the Micon boom was now called Pasokon boom, or just computers. Now, there's a lot of confusions in a lot of the lineages of these different computers. So if you look at Hitachi, when they came out with their Basic Master series, that was actually out of their TV division. Now, before this point, Hitachi had been manufacturing mainframes and minis, but that was out of their computer division. This was computers out of TV. And the MB16000, that came out a few years after the Basic Master. That was kind of like a PC knockoff, that not fully BIOS compatible. Once again, if you look at Sharp, when Sharp came out with the MZ series, that was the MZ80K that I was showing before and the progeny that it had, that was all out of its computer division. But then if you look at the computers, particularly these very popular ones, the X1 and the X68000, that actually came out of their TV division. And NEC was more fragmented than all of them. So that single board TK80 that was so popular for NEC, that was built on a Intel 8080 kind of knockoff, clone. And then when they came out with the PC8001, that was actually from a different part of NEC. So that was the Electronic Device Business Group. But you can kind of see the TK80 guys got pissed off that suddenly another part of NEC was manufacturing home computers after they had had so much success with the TK80. So they built their own PC6001 and PC100. PC100 was a dead rubber. PC6001 had mild success inside of Japan. And then two computers that dominated Japan, PC88 and PC98. Those two computers were done by different divisions. Their biggest competition were each other. So, I'll leave it at that there. So moving on, our friends at Sword, what happened to them? By the 80s, Sword was on its way to becoming the next Sony. And so in 82, they released the M5. So this is like a 50K, something the size of like a Spectrum. And it really was a home games computer. That was its market, and specifically marketed for that. I was talking about Sheena wanting to be a multinational. This got exported to the UK under the CGI banner, but it was still called an M5. And it was quite a popular computer. So by the end of 1983, Sword had domestic sales of 22 billion yen and 35 billion yen globally. And so you consider a guy that wanted to start a $3 billion yen company, and he ends up at these heady heights. So they were basically as big as NEC, but not in terms of units, but more in terms of their dollars. Then in February 83, Sheena got approached by a competitor. And the competitor basically goes, you better get going while the going is good. Better sell your company while you can. And Sheena actually thought about selling the company, but he chose not to sell. He was on his way to being the next Sony. But by coincidence, all of a sudden, his supply chain started to choke and have issues. Companies would not extend credit to Sword customers. Smear campaigns happened in the press or into Sword's bankers, and so on. And even Mitty was hearing and at time passing on bad rumours. So, for example, someone would contact a large Sword customer and say, "Hey, Sword's having a financial financial issue. They're going to be bankrupt soon." So Sheena ends up selling Sword for $3.5 billion to Toshiba in 1985. So they went from being the next Sony to basically selling for pennies on the dollar. So wrapping this up, there was a new era in computing in Japan. So in 83, they sold about 1 million PCs, and to give you an idea, from 76 to 83, they sold 2.2. So you can see that the curve is exponential. NEC became the dominant player, so they did about 42% of all hardware sales and 60% of software sales. And a new Trinity emerged, which would dominate Japan for most of the 80s. So those three were the PC88, the Sharp X1 series, and also the FM7. So that's it. I rushed through that really fast. No worries. Thank you very much.
This was recorded at the Canberra Vintage Computer Exhibition 2004. To find out more, check out the links in the description.